It lingered outside my window. My childhood was riddled with peculiar incidents, the kind that clings to your memory like cobwebs, inexplicable and unsettling. Some were trivial, the scars of growing up in chaos, but others, they were out of the ordinary, the type that doesn't fade with time. These stories, they weigh on me, a heavy cloak I can't seem to shed. Here's one such tale, and as you listen, picture me in a dimly lit room, the shadows dancing on the walls as I speak. I was raised in the kind of place most people speed through on their way to somewhere else. A forgotten speck on the map in the Midwest, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the sky swallows you whole. It's the sort of place where the wind whispers secrets if you listen closely enough. And listen, I did. Our house was an island in an ocean of wheat fields, with the nearest neighbors a good mile away. As a child, I thought it was a castle, surrounded by a moat of golden grains. The reality was less romantic, an aging farmhouse with peeling paint and a roof that leaked more than it kept out the rain. But it was home. The peculiarities of rural life meant I had a lot of time alone, especially in the summers when school was out and my parents were consumed with the ceaseless demands of farm work. I became a keen observer of the small mysteries of nature, the cycles of growth and decay. But there was one mystery, one event that stood apart from the rest. I was 12, teetering on the edge of adolescence when it happened. It was a hot, stifling summer evening, the kind where the air feels thick enough to cut. I'd been tasked with closing up the chicken coop, a chore I'd done countless times before. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, when a sudden chill descended. It was abrupt, unnatural given the season. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt watched. Surveying the fields, I saw nothing but the waves of wheat, yet the sensation persisted. I hurried back towards the house, the unease growing with every step. That night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, until I made the mistake of glancing towards the window. There in the moonlight was a silhouette. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its presence utterly alien. I blinked, and it was gone, but the image was seared into my mind. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination fueled by too many ghost stories. But the unease lingered, a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. Days passed, and the incident repeated itself. Always at dusk, always that same inexplicable chill, followed by the sight of it outside my window. I tried to tell my parents, but they dismissed it as nightmares, the product of an overactive imagination. But I knew better. It wasn't just my imagination. The thing outside my window was real, and it was watching me. It never tried to enter, never made a sound, but its presence was a constant pressure, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I started to dread the night, the inevitable moment when I would feel its gaze upon me. I stopped looking out the window, but that only made it worse. The not knowing, the anticipation of when it might finally make its move. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The nights returned to their usual stillness, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the wheat in the wind. I never saw the figure again, but the memory of it lingered, a ghost story of my own that I could never quite shake. I thought I had left it all behind, the isolation, the endless fields, and the haunting presence that lingered at the edge of my consciousness. But some stories, it seems, refused to be left untold. I had become a creature of the urban jungle, my days filled with the hum of technology and the glow of screens, far removed from the natural rhythms that had defined my childhood. The figure outside my window became a ghost story of my own making, something to share in hushed tones at parties, a curious anecdote from a life that felt increasingly distant. That was until the night it followed me home. It was a night like any other, the city alive with the pulse of nightlife and the glow of neon. I walked the familiar path to my apartment, the sounds of the city a comforting cacophony that drowned out the silence I had once known. But as I turned the corner onto my street, a chill crept down my spine, a whisper of memory that set my nerves on edge. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own footsteps, a trick of the acoustics between the buildings. But then I heard it, a rustling, not unlike the sound of wheat swaying in the wind. My heart raced, my steps quickened, but the sound seemed to keep pace, always just a breath behind me. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was running. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, the rustling sound growing louder, closer. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as if I could hold back the night itself. I told myself it was impossible. The thing from my childhood, the presence that had haunted the edges of my wheat field, couldn't possibly be here, in the heart of the city. It was just my imagination, a shadow cast by the past. But as I moved to draw the curtains of my apartment window, there it was, a figure, tall and indistinct, its limbs too long, just as I remembered. It stood across the street, barely illuminated by the flickering streetlight, a silhouette that shouldn't exist. I watched frozen as it raised a hand, a gesture eerily reminiscent of a wave or perhaps a beckoning. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and jumpy days. I saw it everywhere and nowhere, a phantom that danced just out of sight, always a step behind me, a whisper in the crowd. I began to question my sanity, to doubt the evidence of my own senses. How could something from my past, a figment of rural isolation, find me here, in the midst of the concrete and steel? The answer came on a night when the moon was just a sliver in the sky, the city wrapped in the velvet cloak of near darkness. I was walking home, my steps hurried, when I heard it again, the rustling, the unmistakable sound of something following me. This time, I didn't run. I turned to face it, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure stepped forward, and for the first time I saw it clearly. Not a ghost, not a specter from my past, but a man, his features haggard, his clothes tattered. He stopped just out of reach, his eyes holding mine. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the city. "I didn't mean to scare you. I followed you because you reminded me of home, of the fields and the sky and the silence. I thought maybe you could help me find it again." In that moment I understood. He was lost, a soul adrift in the sea of humanity, seeking connection, seeking solace in the familiar. And in his searching, he had latched onto me, a reminder of the world he had lost. We talked for hours that night, two strangers finding common ground in the shared memories of places long gone. I learned his name, his story, how the city had swallowed him whole, leaving him longing for the simplicity of a life he could never return to. In the end, I helped him find his way back, not to the physical place he had left behind, but to a sense of peace, a reconciliation with the path his life had taken. And in helping him, I found a measure of healing myself, an acceptance of the shadows that had followed me, of the stories that had shaped me. The figure outside my window was no longer a haunting presence, but a reminder that we are all connected, bound by threads of memory and experience, seeking our way through the darkness. And sometimes it's only by facing the ghosts of our past that we can finally move forward into the light. And so, the story that began with a haunting presence outside my childhood window, a tale that had followed me into the heart of the city, found its conclusion not in fear, but in understanding and compassion. The figure that had once filled my nights with dread became a catalyst for connection, a bridge between my past and present, between isolation and community. As the man walked away that night, disappearing into the city's embrace, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a release of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The fear that had once gripped me, that had followed me across the years and miles, had lost its power. In its place was a newfound sense of peace, a realization that the shadows we fear often hold the lessons we need to learn. In the weeks and months that followed, my life resumed its rhythm, the encounter becoming a memory, a story to reflect upon. But the change within me was profound. I found myself more open, more willing to see the humanity in those around me, to listen to the stories that shaped them. I learned that sometimes the things we fear, the ghosts that haunt us, are just lost souls seeking understanding, and that in offering compassion, we find our own healing. The presence outside my window never returned, but the impact of that encounter remained. It taught me that the past is not a specter to be feared, but a teacher, guiding us towards greater empathy and connection. It showed me that even in our darkest moments, there is the potential for growth, for transformation. And so my story ends not with a conclusion, but with a beginning, a stepping stone into a future where the past no longer holds sway over my present. The figure outside my window, once a source of terror, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there is light, if only we're brave enough to see it. In sharing this tale, I cast off the heavy cloak of my past, stepping into the light of understanding and acceptance. My journey from fear to peace, from isolation to connection, is a testament to the power of facing our ghosts, of transforming our stories from hauntings into lessons of resilience and compassion. And so I move forward, not free from the past, but liberated from its hold over me, ready to embrace whatever comes with an open heart and a spirit of curiosity. For in every shadow, there is a story waiting to be told, and in every encounter, a chance to grow, to change, to become more fully ourselves. Thank you for listening to my channel, Creepy Vibes.